Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for another episode of Second Chances. Today, we will discuss the catalyst of crime and the school to prison pipeline. And just to give you all a brief scenario of where we are from where we've come from or where we started, on the previous episodes of Second Chances, we discussed and unpacked the criminal justice system's track record in wrongful conviction, the devastating consequences as a result, and the array of challenges that seeking fair adjudication in such cases where there was a miscarriage of justice, the people who are victims to the guilty until proven innocent order of business suffer immeasurable damage to their confidence in the judicial mechanisms put in place to protect all of our inherent rights of freedom from false imprisonment and dubious grounds. This was our first call to attention for the system to be put on notice to right its wrongs and give careful review of the prosecutorial preoccupation with securing conviction over ensuring fairness and justice of the accused. Next, we followed up with the topic of excessive sentencing, discussing the drive and motives behind harsh punishment and its being rooted in the colonial American corporal punishment policies brought over from England. Harsh punishment for crime was something deeply embedded in the American sentiment and was exasperated during the eras of racist based slavery, which initiated the delineation of society into a race class. The American justice system has been henceforth fraught with racial disparities of the past, and this is largely represented in the numbers of Black and Brown citizens that receive harsh and excessive sentencing that can get us on par with the times, as recent studies continue to show that harsh sentencing does not make our communities any safer, nor accrue any real social or economic benefit. In this episode, we look to delve into the crisis of mass incarceration from the front end, which starts at the neglect of our youth and the overwhelming criminalization of youth through truancy laws, school policing, and the waiver laws for juvenile felons, to adult courts overriding alternative intervention programs. Thank you for joining us, and I'm so happy to announce that today we will have some really amazing guests on, and I will just introduce them as I add them. I'm so excited to have them on with us because they speak from a wide pool of knowledge, maybe an ocean. And so I'm just like overwhelmed. So y'all have to excuse me. I'm a little bit starstruck by my own guests, and I'm just elated. So let me go ahead and without further ado, I will introduce you to Mr. Tio Hardiman, who is the president and executive director of the Violence Interrupters. And we have, excuse me, we also have, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, y'all. We also have the beautiful Lisa Blum, civil rights attorney and New York Times bestselling author of Suspicion Nation, with us today. Thank you both for being here and overcoming our early on technical difficulties. It's a little starstruck for me.
Hi, Lulu.
Hey, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for being on this show. So I would just like to ask you guys to introduce yourself and tell the public what projects you are working on currently right now and how they are able to get in contact with you.
Okay. I will allow, if you don't mind, Attorney Blum, you can go first, and I'll come right after you.
Okay. Thank you, Tio. And thank you, Lulu and McKinney, for having me on. So, my name is Lisa Blum. I'm an attorney. I do civil rights law. I've represented victims of discrimination, harassment, and abuse for over 35 years. I have my own law firm called the Blum Firm. I have about 10 lawyers who work with me on my cases. And some of the cases that we're working on right now, we represent 3 Black Lives Matter protesters who were shot by police rubber bullets during the protests in 2020. One was blinded in one eye, one was shot in the genitals. We think it's just absolutely horrific and really proved the protesters' point that the police overstep and engage in misconduct, especially against African Americans. I also represent a 16-year-old girl named Michaela Robinson, who's been in the news recently because she was just walking down the hall in her own high school and she was body slammed by the school security officer, taken to the ground. He straddled her. She's screaming and yelling. And the only thing she had done wrong was walk away from him. She ends up getting taken to the sheriff's office, arrested. Her mother was not notified. So it's just a terrible story, and it's indicative of the school to prison pipeline. We don't think there should be sheriffs in schools at all. We think that any kind of misconduct by teenagers should be addressed by counselors, mental health folks, school administrators, and we don't need to be having all these police in schools. So we also do a lot of race discrimination in employment, in public services, people who are denied entrance to a store or racially profiled in stores. So those are some of the kinds of cases that we do at my law firm, which is called the Blum firm. Tio.
All right, good. Yeah, Tio Hardiman, president of Violence Interrupters, executive director of Violence Interrupters Incorporated, not-for-profit actually. And then also I serve as an adjunct professor in the field of restorative justice and criminal justice. But Violence Interrupters, you know, it's a public health model aimed at changing mindsets and behaviors associated with violence. We believe violence is learned behavior, and we have to work harder to stop the gun violence on the front end, not after somebody has already crossed the line. Violence Interrupters, we have like a 40-hour training curriculum where I train violence interrupters nationwide, and we train violence interrupters in the field of we have to detect and prevent on the front end. So far this year in Chicago, we have pretty much mediated around maybe 40 conflicts on the front end in which we stop somebody from taking a life. It's not a big number, but it's a solid number. That's what's most important. With a rash of violence going on throughout the United States, we need more boots on the ground. Currently, I have a staff of about 50 violence interrupters, and we plan to hire another 50 violence interrupters within right around the new year, and hopefully we can save more lives. And then what I do, I'm one of them straight up people in this field. I can also produce the people that we save their lives from both ends, which is equally important. That's why the news, they always call me, because we produce. I don't want to just come on here and talk about what we do. I have the actual people in which we save lives on the front end. So that's powerful. It's not that, therefore it's not so much about me. It's about the lives that were saved. Okay. I'm a humble servant of the people.
Thank you both. So from both of your perspectives of being in different fields, in what ways has the government, systems, and society in general failed our youth and contributed to this crisis?
Want me to take it, attorney?
Sure.
Okay. When it comes down to the government, my perception anyway would be that, a lot of times elected officials, they make decisions from the mountaintop instead of coming down to the valley to talk to the people on the ground level. I think that's a big mistake, because even right now, everybody wants to address gun violence or the prison, problem, like different policies that they come up with instead of actually meeting with the inmates, meeting with the people that have been harmed by the prison industrial complex. We know there's a preponderance of evidence that dictates that a lot of people are wrongfully incarcerated too long. And we know that, even with the Black Lives Matter movement, way before that particular movement, you had people out there on the front line fighting against the prison industrial complex, educating people about how, there have been studies done. You can see when young people, especially in the African-American community, by the time they're in third or fourth grade, you will already know that they're going to go to prison based on conditions, based on, distressed communities, fatherless families, the list goes on and on. So when you talk about how the government has failed, in my opinion, everybody wants to make good, statements, and in their mind, they're pushing solid policy, but have they met with the victims, the people that have been impacted most by the problem of prison overcrowding? And that Russia, China, United States are the top 3 for mass incarceration worldwide. So the United States, and we just have a bunch of issues with the prison industrial complex, like I said. And then also another place, in my opinion, where they failed, when it comes down even to the gun violence problem, it's incumbent upon Black leadership to address the gun violence problem, and the government should provide the necessary resources to allow Black leadership to address the problems in their community. And I'll say this and I'll let it go. The reason I say this is because all different cultures and ethnic groups experience some problems with violence on their journey to America, like the Italians, the Jewish people, the Polish people, the Irish people, and they dealt with it. It was incumbent upon the men in their community to deal with it, and they addressed it, even though they got involved with corporate America and they moved on and they uplifted their people. But the men in their community had to address it. I think the government is steady looking for programs. The Black man must address the issues in his or her community, and the woman as well. So that's why I think the government has failed, not listening to the people in the valley, making decisions from a mountaintop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well said, Tio. I agree with everything you said. I would say that the government has failed by failing to root out systemic racism. Let's start with in the schools. So we know that African American children are disproportionately disciplined for things that when white children do them tend to get shrugged off. Things like mouthing off, using bad language, being tardy, being late to school, failing to turn your homework in. None of those are good things. I encourage all students to do their best and to work hard and to follow the rules. But we know that most kids are going to occasionally break the rules. So you mentioned, Lulu, my book, Suspicion Nation, which is about the Trayvon Martin case. And we all remember Trayvon Martin, of course, who was 17 years old, a Florida kid walking down the street with some Skittles in his pocket and a soda in his hand. And he was accosted by a neighborhood watch guy named George Zimmerman. And within a few minutes, Trayvon was dead, and George Zimmerman was put on trial and ultimately acquitted. And why was he acquitted? Because the jury believed that Trayvon Martin was the aggressor in spite of all of the evidence. But I went back and looked at why Trayvon Martin was even there in the first place. And the reason why he was there, it was not his community. He was there because he had been suspended from school. He had been suspended from school for having a tiny amount of marijuana in a baggie in his backpack. And even according to the school's own guidelines, he should not have been suspended for that. He was suspended for a week for that. Suspending kids is the absolute worst thing we can do. Then we send teenagers out onto the street, many of them unsupervised. Most people's parents work. In this case, Trayvon's dad took him to visit the dad's girlfriend, and he was in this unfamiliar community, mostly white community, where they perceived him as a threat because of his black skin. And that's what George Zimmerman testified, that there had been an African-American burglar 6 months earlier. And therefore, in George Zimmerman's mind, every African-American person was suspect. Attributing the wrongs of one person who's black to all black people is the very definition of racism. But nobody called the prosecution out on that. Nobody called George Zimmerman out on that. And Trayvon Martin, at the age of 17, unarmed, ended up dead, and no justice for him. This is a horrible story. And it's perhaps a more extreme version of what happens to a lot of kids every day. African-American kids, as I said, disproportionately suspended, expelled, arrested. When they are arrested, for example, when a black kid and a white kid are arrested for cannabis possession, which I think most of us agree should not even be a crime at this point, but it still is in many places, the white kid is far more likely to get a slap on the wrist, some kind of diversion, which means you just do some community service and it's expunged from your record. And the African-American kid is more likely to be incarcerated. And of course, once you're incarcerated, you're more likely to get stuck in the system again and again. So there's a great deal of work to do. There's many, many people who have been speaking out over the years about systemic racism, both in the schools and in the criminal justice system. We know it's there. We know what to do about it. It's just a matter of the political will to get the policies in place and to stop it.
Yes.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that it's just unfortunate that once you know something is broken, instead of even taking small steps to try to revive the system that you have in place, that you are very well aware disproportionately serves an abundance of people, or puts them in predicaments that they can't necessarily find their way out. I mean, I tried to go and fight a traffic ticket that I had gotten erroneously for being pulled over for nothing, honestly. And there were people in the court system just for traffic that didn't understand completely what was going on. So imagine being a child who is put under certain circumstances because of disciplinary sanctions that have happened at school. And now all of a sudden we're in the system. And this is something that I've experienced with my own child, where the school resource officer is saying, we're going to press charges. And I said, well, why are we pressing charges when she's never shot a rock while she was with me? This was something you all were doing. And so I think that when we don't have enough knowledge on how to fight injustices that start happening as early as, adolescence, elementary school, people are ramping up the behaviors of different children, categorizing them, and then never allowing them to leave those categories from year to year. It's like, I'm being warned, oh my gosh, this, you got him, he's horrible, never giving a child an opportunity to flourish. Especially in the school setting, having been a school administrator, it's awful. And so I think that it's important that we continue to recognize that the system is flawed and it's broken until people listen and they hear us. Because a lot of times, especially nowadays, people do not connect to things that don't apply to them. So if you don't have any knowledge of what goes on in an inner city school, because that's not what happens at your school, then you don't have any compassion or empathy towards the type of mannerisms and behaviors that take place inside of those places. And the only way that we can get around that is sharing stories with people who may be in positions to help without having the actual knowledge of what goes on.
I agree 100%. I also do think that we should be putting more resources to mental health and counselors in the schools as opposed to disciplinary actions such as kicking them out of the school or having them miss out on classes because they have to be in detention for days and weeks. I think that a lot of things do stem from home, and being that a lot of kids are living in unstable conditions, especially with their families, because a lot of people don't understand what kids are dealing with when they go home. And a lot of the times their actions are based off of what is going on inside that house. And what I've learned with dealing with some young girls in inner city communities is that they've gone through a lot of trauma and a lot of abuse. And there's a lot of domestic violence that is not being addressed. And for some reason, when it comes to things like domestic violence, a lot of the times the resolution to that is we're going to arrest everybody instead of the person that is actually doing the harm in the home. So with that being said, knowing that the psychological stability of a child is predicted on that child's home life, what ways have shown to be most effective in helping youth coming from dysfunctional homes and communities?
Well, it's very important to set up some type of safety network where we can catch some of these young people to the best of our ability. I'm the former director of Ceasefire Illinois as well. There was a time when I was working with about 1,200 high-risk young people in Chicago, and we charted everything we did. We documented. We spent 22,000 man hours with the young people, conducting home visits. So when you ask what more can be done, it's just there has to be a very serious orchestrated approach where you can, all hands on deck to kind of make sure none of them young people fall through the cracks and crevices of society. That's something that has to be done because some young people may not listen to this person, but they may listen to another person. So we have to find out who in their family they might listen to. And I use myself as the best example. When people talk to me, even though, I made some moves in my life and I'm grateful to God, but I grew up in a very dysfunctional household. I was one of them guys at 11, 12, 13 who grew up watching my uncles use drugs and a whole lot of violence in the community in the projects where I grew up. We didn't have one day where there was peace. It was always something going on. And I've witnessed violence and all that kind of crazy stuff. So for a period of time, guys like myself, we try to shut our conscience down a little bit so we won't be so impacted by it. See, we become desensitized, towards what's, in regards to what's going on around us. But, I was able to come out of that and began to really extend my hand to a lot of people because people just hurt other people. The trauma people have to experience and deal with is on a whole nother planet because, some people, you try to get them to understand they're not there because it's so deeply entrenched inside of their spirit that we have to help them unlearn some of the behaviors that they've picked up, over the years. I'm talking about even young people, 15, 16 years old, because if they grew up in one of those type of households from the age of 6 years old, now they're 15, all those experiences are right there in their mind. So we have to work with them, meet them where they are, and make sure we hire the right practitioners that can really reach them and help bring them out of that. And that first line of a practitioner just might be somebody like a violence interrupter, somebody that they can work with. And then once we begin the working process with them, then we refer them to higher level services. Because I tell you, if you can overcome some of your trauma, that's major. Put it like that. That's a major step in the right direction, because a lot of people they revert back to what's on their mind or their trauma, and they cannot progress in life. We're adults, but we look like adults, but on the inside, we're really struggling. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think needs to happen right now.
Well said, Tio. And, as to what we can do for kids, I can come at this just as a human being and a mom and say, we can all reach out a hand to a kid in need. I have 2 biological children and 2 foster children, and I love all of them. And as to the foster children, it's a great experience being a foster mom. I would encourage everybody who thinks that they might be interested to really consider it, to take on a foster child. You can really change a child's life. As the lawyer in me, I would say that it's important for young people to learn how to stand up for their rights as soon as possible. You don't have to be 18 to stand up for your rights. I've represented kids as young as 12 and filed complaints on their behalf. You don't even have to have a lawyer. You could do a written complaint, very polite, straightforward, just the facts, say who, what, when, where, what happened to you. File it with the school district. And stand up for yourself. Complain if there's somebody who's mistreating you. Complain if you feel that you're the victim of racial profiling. Maybe you'll get a good result. Maybe you'll be one of multiple people who are standing up and finally somebody will listen. And I would say also, don't be a bystander, be an upstander. If you see someone being treated badly in your school and you're a young person, stand up for them. In the case I mentioned of my 16-year-old African-American client, Michaela Robinson, who was assaulted by a school security officer, thank goodness another kid pulled out his phone and started recording. And so we have a video. Thank goodness this other young person had the presence of mind to do that. We then had a rally outside of the school a couple of weeks ago, and I was delighted to see hundreds and hundreds of students coming out in support of Michaela. For teenagers, having the support of your peers is very important. I think we can all remember when we were teenagers and wanting other people to like us and care about us. That was a very big deal. Now that I'm old, I really don't care what people think of me. But when I was 16, that was a big deal for me, just like it is for any 16-year-old. So showing support to somebody if they've been mistreated, or you think they're a victim of trauma, or they're just having a mental health struggle, having a hard time, showing them a little love and support, it can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that just as a parent, and I always try to focus on being the best parent that I can be, because we're all not made up of the same things. And so I think that the most valuable information that somebody gave me when my daughter was very, very young was that if I taught her to make good choices from the very simple things all throughout her life, it will be much simpler as she becomes a young adult, as she becomes someone who is influenced by her peers, to kind of make that judgment call on her own. Because a lot of times what I see happening is people just do what they're told. And once you become of age where someone expects you to make a decision, you don't always go with the right decision because you haven't been programmed with the proper discernment to determine which decision is actually the best decision for you to make. And so whether it was, being 5 years old and choosing what you want for dinner when we're at a restaurant, even if it's a McDonald's, do you want chicken nuggets or a burger? Now to being a young adult, to say, sure, you can go out with whoever you want, whichever one of them you would let hold of, $1 million or $500 or what have you. And so it helps to kind of put some perspective on it. I think that we can talk about the village being a part for the children, and the children trying to do their best because they feel accepted. But we also need to give some responsibility to the parents as well. It's one thing for the village to be all inclusive and all in for our kids, but if what's being taught and what's being shown at home is not conducive to our kids' health or our kids' well-being, then that's a problem. And I think that is also a conversation that we need to have. You can be as dysfunctional as you want and you can tell your kids the right things, but kids will only do what they see and not what they hear.
Always.
Absolutely. What are some environmental factors that play a part in a child's development, and how the government and community work to improve them?
Well, you have a lot of environmental factors excuse me, that play a role, but you have to understand that that's a whole higher level. Like, for example, years ago, even in the housing projects, people talked about lead being in the water pipes and stuff, and how lead may be one of the precursors or one of the catalysts that could actually serve as a way to kind of mess up. I'm trying to get my language right. Kind of mess up the minds of people at one time or another, and it leads to some violent behavior with some young people. There's been some research done, in other words. And then you look at the environments, you look at some of the stressors out there. If you look at economically blighted communities, that's like all through, like, for example, in the South Side of Chicago, West Side, some parts of Baltimore, Philly, even some parts of New York, a lot of young people don't have nothing to look forward to. So that's a stressor in itself, because, like, for example, in Illinois, there's a city called East St. Louis, Illinois. And East St. Louis looks the same way it looked probably 30 years ago. I'm talking about zero development, and young people are growing up in an environment like that. You have abandoned buildings. Almost every other house is abandoned or dilapidated buildings. So those environmental stressors, it produces a situation where people feel hopeless. There's a lot of despair, and people don't feel they can overcome those type of odds. Which some people do, but for the most part, that's where the prison pipeline fits in, because a lot of young people end up being locked up because of environmental stressors. And what the government can do, and I'm saying this just being straight up with everybody here, you have a lot of billionaires that run for office all the time, people that have resources that can really make a difference. Instead of just trying to secure the votes of the people, work something out to change some of the conditions in the community, right? If you're a billionaire, build an oasis. What I mean by an oasis is like a business center, like some technology centers in the community. Instead of spending all the money on your campaign while you're running as a billionaire, spend some of that money to build some technology centers, build some type of educational centers, some type of networks in the community where young people can become more attracted to becoming more self-sufficient, and help people along the way. And quickly, let me say this. So everybody must understand, the prison industrial complex really originated out of medieval Europe with the castles and all that kind of stuff. That's a long educational history, but the prison system today, the way they're locking people up in 6x9 cells, all of that stems from medieval, type of institutions. The first penitentiary in the United States was built in Pennsylvania, and it's all about locking people up, throw the key away mentality. And prisons are not really meant to reform people. A lot of young people go to prison, they become worse off before they even enter prison, because now you have to join a prison type of code of conduct, and you cannot play with that. Those guys are dealing with hardcore time there. And then solitary confinement, which we already know, Attorney Blum, is inhumane. People being locked up for 23 hours a day, 24 hours a day, it's inhumane. A lot of prisoners right now, a lot of them find themselves on some type of medication just to cope with the conditions. So we have a lot of work to do as far as the government dealing with environmental stressors, because especially in some African American communities, maybe some Latino, and even some poor white communities. Possibly there's a situation where some people they look forward to going to prison opposed to going to college. So we have to change that mindset to a degree, because that shouldn't be no rites of passage for people to think they should go to prison instead of, becoming a productive member of society. But when you talk about environmental pressures and conditions, a lot of this goes into the environment. Some of the studies, for example, a lot of universities are funded every year like 20, $30 million to do research on why African American people shoot and kill each other. The same research is done every year. We know that environmental stresses, and then there's a theory called the strain theory, where people are under some type of pressure and strain. They figure they got to step on somebody else in order to uplift themselves, in other words. So environmental conditions play a role in that type of thinking as well. So I just want to share that for right now. That's my perception.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and Lisa, let me just actually stop you before you answer that, because there's a question in the chat from a viewer that kind of couples with this, and it speaks specifically to your book. It says, question for Squire Blum. In your book, you give data compiled from extensive research about implicit biases and racial bias. Is it safe to say that these biases from school and social policies, and if so, how can they be addressed? Does that?
So thank you for reading my book. I'm always very excited to meet a reader, because most people don't read books, but I do, and I appreciate when people read mine. So for those who are not familiar with implicit bias, I think implicit bias is at the root of a lot of the problem of systemic racism, because most people, if you say, hey, are you a racist? They will say no, and they will be very offended that you even suggested it. And yet, we have all of these outcomes, these racially biased outcomes, so we know we have a problem. So where is the problem coming from? So these very smart researchers at Harvard University came up with the implicit bias test. I think it's implicitbias.com or something like that, and anybody can take it. It's free. It takes about 15 minutes, and it's very smart because you can't cheat the test. And I took the test. I talk about it in the book. Millions of people have taken the test. It turns out that white people, about 75% of us, test for moderate or severe racial bias against African Americans. And African Americans, about 50%, test for moderate or severe racial bias against their own group, African Americans. And when I wrote my book, and I went all over the country speaking about it, mostly at Black colleges and Black churches, and all the Black folks went, oh yeah, we know that. And none of the white people had the faintest idea. And they were completely shocked and horrified. And so that's the bad news, is that there's a great deal of racial bias, especially among white people, but also among Black people. The good news is that there are ways to address it. We do have solutions. And one of those solutions is just to talk very openly about it. So I suggest, for example, that in courtrooms, like in the Trayvon Martin case, it would have been great if the judge had given an instruction, as some other judges have done, something like this. Ladies and gentlemen on the jury, and here we have a case of a Black person and a white person who engaged in an altercation, and you have to decide who was the aggressor. It's very important that you not let any racial bias come into the case. We all live in a culture with a lot of different racial biases. I am subject to them. You are probably subject to them. And if you think that might be the case, try switching the races of the two people in your mind and see if you think of them the same way. So I could go on, but the important thing is to be inclusive and to talk about yourself, not to point the finger and say, you on the jury, you're probably racist, which you get a very defensive response to that. But to say that I surely have some of these biases in me, and you perhaps do as well. And when I talk to people this way, I get a pretty good response. So how can, I think the question was, how can schools and prisons and police officers deal with racial bias? There are classes for police officers in some cities. I think Las Vegas was one of them, and kudos to them for that, where they have police officers do simulated video trainings. They have to look for a shooter in a crowd. Who do they pick out? Because we know that African Americans, if they have a cell phone in their hand, it's more likely to be perceived as a gun than if a white person, right, has a cell phone. And police do have to make split-second decisions. And so it's important for them to become aware of racial biases and to become, to try to take steps to prevent that racial bias. Generally, when people become aware, this data shows that for a period of time, it does reduce, because most of us don't want to have these biases. We don't want to act on them for no other reason than it's irrational and it's dangerous and it's harmful to people. But we have doctors, for example, have implicit bias trainings, because we know that doctors are more likely to send white people to specialists than they are to African Americans. They're more likely to dismiss medical complaints from African Americans. So this is a problem that really cuts across every profession. But again, the good news is that there are programs that are in place that really do make a difference. People have to do them probably once a year for the rest of their lives, because the effects fade over time. But if we keep doing it and we keep reminding people and we keep helping people overcome biases. In my profession, by the way, in the legal profession, we have to do continuing education classes that include biases based on race, sex, age, sexual orientation, disability, number of different factors. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that every profession, especially police, teachers, people who have an effect on young people, they should have to do those classes.
I agree. Well said. So with that being said, what needs to be done to change these perceptions of Black youth as violent criminals?
So, that I would really answer that question with what I just said, with the implicit bias. And we all have to become aware of it. We know that, like, when people are given a picture of a white youth and a Black youth, both of whom have a very blank expression on their face, most people, especially white people, will think that the Black youth looks threatening and the white youth does not, when they have the identical expression on their face. This is a problem for people like Trayvon Martin and many young African Americans who were assaulted by police. We have to bring that to their attention. I wanted to respond quickly to the previous question about environmental issues, because I just want to say that in my spare time, such as it is, I'm also a climate change activist. And when we talk about environmental issues, we have to talk about climate change, which I would call climate crisis, and of course, talk about climate justice, because we know that with the ravages of climate change that are already upon us, they disproportionately affect communities of color. Those communities are not shored up as much to protect them from, violent wildfires and flooding and storms. It's always those communities that get it the worst. So as much as I would really just like to focus on civil rights, that's been my life's work, and that's will continue to be my life's work until my final breaths. I've also come to realize that we have to talk about climate crisis, because it's here. And if we don't have a home, we don't have anything. And again, it especially disproportionately affects communities of color.
Yes, and we also have to work harder to educate the media in regards to how they portray African American young men, because for the most part, there's only a small percentage of African American young men that are breaking the law. But when you look at the news, every day you see them parading African American young men all over the place. We have to address the music industry as well. I know a lot of people may not want to delve into this topic, but a lot of the negative rap music, when I mean negative rap music, we salute rap music. I'm a rap fan, Big Daddy Kane days, LL Cool J, right? But the thing is this here, the rap of today, any type of content that's out there that's talking about killing somebody, all the people you smoked and killed, we shouldn't accept that as a people. There should be some type of outcry to address. We want the young guys to make money and produce their music, but if they're producing killing type of content, we should address that. I just organized a press conference in Chicago about Facebook. Facebook should design a filter to detect, intercept, and delete any type of violent content with people going back and forth talking about shooting and killing one another. So we have to change that narrative and begin to parade a lot of the college graduates out there, African-American young men that are businessmen, because it's plentiful. We have a lot of African-American young people taking care of their business, but those stories are not being told. See, you have to understand the everyday news, they're bombarding the news waves with all these stories, which they should, share the news, cover the stories. I got it. Like right now in Chicago, I'm one of them outspoken young men against police brutality, excessive force, but I'm speaking up for a Caucasian police officer now. This young lady was carjacked, Five African American guys carjacked her. She's a police officer. She was off duty, and she fired a shot when they drove the car. She just fired a shot. She didn't hit nobody, but right now in Cook County, they pressed charges on her, felony charges on her for firing a shot at some guys that carjacked her. I'm saying enough is enough. We have to stand up. See, there has to be an equal balance, in other words, right? I'm definitely for the people, but I'm not going to sit back. And I plan to I'm organizing a press conference to speak up for the young lady tomorrow. There's pros and cons. Some people mad at me already, like, now you're speaking up for the police. In my opinion, this was not right. She was off duty. She was a civilian. She was carjacked. She felt threatened, even though the threat had driven away. So I'm just using this as an example. So we have to, when you talk about what more can be done, we have to begin to push positive imagery throughout the media and on the songs and all that kind of, and like throughout the airways everywhere, because it's going to take a massive effort to kind of reframe the way people look at African-American young men. It's going to take a massive effort from everybody so we can get the right images out there.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, I do think that we have to have a certain level of accountability within our own communities. We have to reprogram the way that we think and feel about one another and the value that we see in the life of another person, because that's just not something, even for me, growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, it's just not something that was a given or a norm for people to think, depending upon their circumstances. There are a lot of times when I was young, when I would see, guys who would get so upset over the littlest things, like stepping on their tennis shoes, and they'll be ready to kill and take somebody's life. And I just wonder, at what point, where did that come from, and how do we change that? And I mean, for myself, I did my own digging. And I always tell people, you can't get something out of someone that wasn't put in. But what was put in over a long, extensive period of time was the ramifications of slavery. And I tell people all the time, because I'm actually 40 years old and I'm a first generation removed from slavery. I have aunts and uncles who died in my lifetime as sharecroppers selling peaches when I was 15 and 16 years old. And so what we know is abuse. What we know is, when you're not doing the right thing, I'm going to beat you till you do it. Or I'm going to, take your life, because as we've said in the previous, and it kind of was dressed up a little bit in one of the past episodes, that the death penalty was utilized for everything. The death penalty was utilized for everything, but it was utilized in the force of hanging, public beatings, burnings, all kinds of different things that kind of took place. And so what we have to do is acknowledge, I think that the biggest problem for me is that people want to song and dance around how we actually got here. Well, if I beat somebody every single day for the next 20 years or 50 years or 60 years, whether I'm beating them physically or I'm beating them through socioeconomics and actually education and opportunity, that at some point people are going to retaliate based on what they know, and what is turned in. And I think it's just turned into this just big cluster, for lack of better words, because we don't have any concept of self and who we are. My father always told me, we're the only people who came over to this country without bags. And so when you have had to kind of get it out of the mud, as we say, for lack of better terms, it creates this undue unrest between us as a people for a long, extensive period of time. But because no one on the right side of the system, or on the right side of education, or on the right side of power will say, this is what's broken, we can't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
so go ahead,
yeah.
Tia.
No, I'm good. I'm just following everybody's lead here. I don't want to do all the talking.
Yeah.
So, in the landscape of crisis intervention and youth outreach work, from your individual expertise, Lisa, as an analyst, and Tio as a violence interrupter, how do you collaborative efforts between your two fields come together to build effective strategies?
Well, it's all about educating people. I think the two fields can intersect at different times. You know, my job is to educate young people and people on all levels, all across the world, in the area that, you know, violence is learned behavior, and we can unlearn some of the behaviors that we picked up, that we learned, you know, throughout our life's journey. And therefore, and then we take it to another level to talk about the restorative justice, repairing the harm, because restorative justice is very, very important. Victim offender mediations. And once again, a lot of people don't focus on victims all the time. What we have going on right now, people raising a lot of money off the gun violence in, you know, different cities across the United States. The police raise millions of dollars in their budget based on the homicide numbers and the shooting numbers. What I'm saying now, give that money to the families that lost their loved ones. Give that money to the victims of the violence, because the reality is that you're raising money, and especially if the numbers are not really being reduced. I mean, what's really going on? So I think that there's an intersection where we have to educate the masses of the people, help people heal. It's about healing right now. You have to understand, a lot of people that lost their loved ones to gun violence prematurely. I know so many families, man, that people are just so distraught. And I'm talking about people have been distraught for years after years. I'm not talking about 1 year, 10, 15 years. I know a young lady, she ended up passing away a year ago. Her daughter was killed in the Inglewood community on the south side of Chicago. She died 2 years later. The lady, she just lost her entire appetite. Her kidneys gave out. She could not deal with the stress. So people need help out here. So my thing is, if we can just set up some type of all hands on deck safety network to catch everybody where they are, because a lot of times people may not talk about what's going on with them, and we need a system where we can kind of identify the right people, like I said, that can bring it out of them, because we don't want to lose nobody. We're losing too many people already, and that's one way I think we can intersect. We do the work as violence interrupters, and we refer people to, you know, social services as well, but on a higher level, people can actually help out and make higher level connections, because when you see young people that you've helped, and now you connect them, like I say, not just to a job, just a higher level of thinking. That's major, because now they're thinking in a proper way. They cannot change their conditions or circumstances, but they can think a little different that would allow them to help change their circumstances, if that makes sense to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it does. And I want to pick up on the point you made, Tio, about restorative justice mediations, because I've done a number of those and I have to push people into it. They usually don't want to do it. And for those who are not familiar with what that is, restorative justice began in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. And basically, one half of the country hated the other half. It was more like 80% and 20%. But you know, how are they going to heal the country? How are they going to bring the country together so that it wasn't just an endless civil war? And restorative justice proceedings is what they did, where victims would sit across from the perpetrator and say, you know, you murdered my family. I mean, this is really horrific stuff. And when the perpetrators would admit to it and take accountability for it, they would not get prosecuted. And so this has evolved. I've used restorative justice in a lot of my sexual assault cases, where we have a mediation, which is a private proceeding. It's confidential, but my client, who's typically a rape victim, comes in and she is allowed to speak and say what happened, and she's allowed to say really whatever she wants to say. And it's heartbreaking and really very moving what my clients come up with. And the perpetrator then either takes accountability or doesn't, but she at least had the opportunity to sit across and confront him and be heard. And then we move on to the financial compensation part of it. And we've had some really good success. I've had clients say, this was one of the most important days of my life, where I finally got this thing off my shoulders and I can move on with my life. So I love the idea of restorative justice also for gun violence victims. Instead of, you know, throwing people into prison for the rest of their lives, which is not working, certainly for them, for their families, for the community, or for any of the rest of us. It's an archaic system. You know, Tio, you talked earlier on about people being in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, which the United Nations has recognized as torture. And we're one of the few countries left that does that, and we still do it. You know, many of us can remember at the beginning of the pandemic when we were in lockdown in our own homes, and people would make this analogy, oh, it's like being in prison. Of course, it's not anything like being in prison. You're at home, you can watch Netflix, you got your refrigerator, you can be with your family and people who love you, you can go on the internet, you know, it's not anything like being in prison. But many of us felt like we were losing our minds after a couple of weeks in lockdown. Okay, imagine being in solitary in an 8x8 cell 23 hours a day, for months and months, sometimes for years. I mean, it's horrific. There's no human mind that can survive that without a significant psychological trauma being inflicted. And the younger the person, the worse it is. People with pre-existing mental health problems, which is a lot of people in prison, suffer from that. So what I want to say, just to conclude in response to this, is that lawyers like me, we love to work with activists who are doing things in the community to effectuate change, to raise consciousness, to get education, so that when I get jurors in the courtroom, I don't have to explain from square one, hey, we have a system that's got systemic racism in it. If people already understand a little bit of that, that certainly helps me. And everything that we're all doing here and that many other people are doing to try to change the school to prison pipeline is just tremendously important.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for just saying that, because I think, and McKinney, I'll let you go, but I just really think that if we look at it from the component of restorative justice, I mean, even in our own families, when we make mistakes, we're not just pushed completely out in a way. You know, we acknowledge the mistakes that we've made, our families bring them to our attention, whether we want them to or not, and then we work to rebuild from that place. And so, as you all speak about victims and victims having rights, it's extremely important that we give victims the opportunity to heal. We also give the people who created or committed the offenses the opportunity to heal, because a lot of times, and I know a lot of people who are serving a lot of time who have committed violent crimes, they have to live with their decision every single day, and in a very, very difficult way, because in essence they have, even though they are alive, they have, it's like a social death, so there's no point in
Yes.
a lot of the prisons for rehabilitative efforts, especially if they're violent offenses or considered violent offenders. And so it's very important that we start to develop ways that we can bring healing to both sides, so that people who have committed offenses can understand the pain that they've inflicted to the communities, the person, the family, the extended family and friends of that particular person. If by chance, I mean, because I think those are all things that people don't take into consideration. And so if we focused and moved our system towards that type of focus, I think we will see a lot more success, as opposed to, lock them up, throw away the key, and then the person who is actually the victim never hears about the particular person who's committed the offense, unless they're moving in a prison or unless they're getting ready to be released. And at that time, then it's like you're just re-victimizing the victim when you've made millions and millions of dollars over someone's incarceration, but you haven't created the programming that will afford for people to find a place of healing and to come out and actually be a successful part of society, having served their time, and victims feeling healed from the circumstance, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
McKinney.
So with that being said, how do you think, or what do you think community leaders can create a safe space? Because say they start creating all these programs to put in the prisons and in the schools, how do we actually get the community that is affected by incarceration, indirectly, to feel safe enough to emote their feelings in a healthy, constructive way?
Well, I have a real quick answer for you. The same way we're setting up sanctuary cities, there should be some sanctuary type of locations where people can feel free to share their emotions and deal with the trauma. Like a safe space where they can go and talk to one person, have a restorative justice peace circle, or a restorative justice healing circle. And I think that's one way. That's something legislators should take a look at, setting up some restorative justice practices in communities. Like right in the thick of the neighborhoods, where the people, because the people don't know how to deal with, for example, Attorney Blum, there's a person, let's say a guy does 20 years and he's released, but he's in solitary confinement for about 80% of his time while he was in prison. Now, when he's released, he probably doesn't even know how to socialize with people. So to help people reintegrate, reassimilate back into society. So that's a good question you asked. But I would say that legislators should set up some type of process where they can open up them restorative. It's all about restorative justice centers in neighborhoods across America.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And one of the things that we're starting to talk about more in this country is mental health, and that's a good thing. We see prominent athletes at the top of their game, like Simone Biles or Serena Williams, talking about mental health struggles, and I think that's extremely healthy. I have read that 1 in 5 Americans has a significant mental health issue. And I see that, of course, in all of my clients: depression, anxiety, post traumatic stress. If you have a family member who's incarcerated, you are really treated like dirt by the system, from the ridiculous expensive phone calls to the runaround you get when you try to go visit, and the long waits and the humiliating security searches. I've gone to visit clients in prison and I was treated very badly, and I'm an attorney and they know I'm an attorney. So, I know it's one of the most important factors for reintegrating somebody in the community when they come out is whether they have healthy family ties. Why would we want to interrupt those family ties? Why wouldn't we want to strengthen those family ties as much as we can, to have those phone calls, those visits, allow people to have that connection with their family. And for the family members, the mental health struggles are very real, very painful. We are all talking about mental health more now. That's a good thing. Let's move from talking to actually funding it. Because still many people I know, they say, okay, I'm willing to go to talk to a therapist. We've gotten over the stigma of that, but I can't afford it. They're $100 an hour or $150 an hour. Who can afford that for more than 1 or 2 sessions? Very few people. So we need to have free or low cost mental health counseling for people. But, the best way to make the situation better is fundamental change. So we have, for nonviolent offenses, there's no reason for people to be going to prison at all. For violent offenses, we have to really look at incarceration and what we're doing and how long these sentences are. I have a dear friend I went to high school with who became a bank robber when he was young, and he went to prison for 9 years, and he got out, and then he's become an advocate for criminal justice reform. And he's really impressed upon me, how long 5 years is, for example. People will say, oh, 5 years, that's nothing. 10 years, throw the book at him, right? People who really aren't well informed. 5 years is a very, very long time to become incarcerated. And for young people, especially if someone's 19 years old, 20 years old, that's like a lifetime for them. So, and of course, once they're in, we should have training programs for them, educational programs, counseling for them. We used to have a real emphasis on rehabilitation. That's mostly gone away, and it's just about punishment now. And so when people get out, they reoffend at very high rates, which is to be expected. So I'm a big advocate for mental health services, both for people who are incarcerated and for the family members and for the communities, because that's just, I think, essential.
I agree.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay. I really want to thank you both for being with us today. It has been such an honor. As y'all know, I've been completely starstruck the entire time because I think a lot of both of you. Tio Hardiman is very key in the community as far as the violence interrupters are concerned. And for anyone who needs knowledge on that, they do have a PBS documentary on. It's called The Interrupters specifically, and you can check him out that way. You can also, if you want to reach out to him or his organization, it's called violenceinterrupters.org, and you can meet him there. Even if you wanted to become a violence interrupter in your community, I'm sure that they could help get you trained with that. And Lisa, just thank you so much for being here with us. Your book has been a very pivotal piece of education for me during a time when I was very concerned with how the whole Trayvon Martin case went. It was the part that that was my first instance of my heart being broken by our system specifically. And so I thank you for being here and speaking with us about the topics that are near and dear to our hearts, because we need to have people on both sides of the field. We have to have people out in the field, as well as people speaking on the professional side to some of the different things that we just cannot articulate ourselves. And so I thank you.
Yes.
Well, that's very kind, Lulu. Thank you. And thank you, McKinney. And Lulu, when I wrote this book a couple of years ago, I just thought the Trayvon Martin case is going to be a historic case. People are going to be looking at it in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And I just have to make a record of what happened so that people can understand what happened from inside the courtroom and inside the justice system. And that's why I did it. So I really did it so that somebody like you, Lulu, would one day read it and be able to get that information. So it means a lot to me to hear that from you. Thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. McKinney and Lulu, I support you both very much for what you do, and everybody out there who's standing up against injustice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Lisa. All right. And you all have a great evening.
Night.
This has been another episode of Second Chances.